Let's get to the next section because we're running a little later than I thought. And I know this is going to be in a lot of people's minds. As you go through the first section, I'm sure this comes to mind. What is the extent of the Genesis flood? And again, next slide. What's the purpose of going through this? To resolve perceived errors in the biblical flood account, to provide positive evidence for the reliability of the Genesis record, to gain powerful insight into God's judgment, deliverance, and plan for mankind. Again, this is one of those areas where people criticize the Bible, they criticize Christians. Let's take a look. Really, what is the extent of the Genesis flood? Next slide. What are some of the keys to understanding this? Identify the proper frame of reference, point of view of the observer. This is a very important point. Again, consider the time scales and observations provided when constructing a chronology. Be aware of the Hebrew nouns and their specific meanings. Only consider an interpretation that is consistent with all of Scripture and the facts of nature. Okay, next slide, please. So what are some of the key observations? Well, the flood was universal in that it encompassed all of humanity. No matter what view you take on the flood accounts, we can agree that it encompassed all of humanity from a biblical perspective. But as we learn, humanity failed to obey God's command to fill the earth and thus limited the extent of man's sin. The only creatures mentioned are birds and mammals, as far as and land mammals, as far as being aboard the ark. There's no mention of sea creatures, no mention of insects, only birds and land mammals. Genesis 8, and we're going to go through virtually all of Genesis 8, describes the frame of reference for the flood account, and other biblical passages give insight into the extent of the flood. Let's take a look. Next slide. So here's how the chronology lays down. Before we get to chapter 8, rain begins in the 17th day of the second month of Noah's 600th year, and you find that in Genesis 7. Rains for 40 days and 40 nights. But the water continues to increase for 150 days. Now, if you remember, like when Katrina came through, it rained for only, one day? But the waters kept rising for weeks afterwards. Same thing here. You get 40 days and 40 nights in an area that's not used to water. Matter of fact, there's some potential good evidence that could have been the event that flooded the Persian Gulf. Which is why the Garden of Eden is probably underwater right now. Somewhere in the southern area. If you look at the rivers that are mentioned in Genesis 1, the only place where they seem to connect would be in the Persian Gulf. So here we are. We have the water increasing for 150 days. So now you go to the next slide, please. Oh, I don't know if I'm going to be able to read that from here. Let me see. But God remembered Noah and all the animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent the wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The water receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down. So again, it mentions the 150 days. And on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat, which is exactly 150 days after the water started. It started on the 17th day of the 2nd month. Now we're on the 17th day of the 7th month. And the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat. Notice it does not say the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat. Very often people make that claim, and it does not say Mount Ararat. It says in the mountains of Ararat, which is a very broad region. It could refer to the mountain peaks. It could refer to the valleys between the mountains. So we have to be very careful there again. If you want to spend your money and for people to find the ark, it's probably not going to find it on Mount Ararat. Matter of fact, I don't think you're going to find it at all. Because I think once they get off the ark, that wood is going to be very attractive to build shelters and buildings with. So probably rather than going cutting down new trees, they probably would take that wood first and make use out of it. The water continued to recede until the 10th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. The words are trying to become visible too to me. But the tops of the mountains became visible. And here's one of the first things I noticed when I looked at this. Wait a minute. The ark comes to rest in the 17th day of the 7th month in the mountains of Ararat. 2.5 months later, the mountains become visible. Now, if you take the view that the ark came to rest some 10,000 or higher feet above sea level, and the water's got to recede down to its current levels, the water's going to be receding 50 to 100 feet a day to get down to that level. You should be able to come out of the ark in a week. And here it's 2.5 months. And the mountains now are becoming visible. The next slide, please. So the ark comes to rest, as I just described, and the mountains become visible. Next slide. After 40 days, Noah sends out a raven, and that's really hard for me to see. Oh yeah, good idea. After 40 days, Noah opened the window he had made in the ark and sent out a raven, and it kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground, but the dove could find no place to set its feet because there was water over all the surface of the earth. Anybody notice a problem there?
Where did the water go?
Yeah, we have the mountains have already become visible, and now he sends out the sends out the dove, and he says there's water over all the surface of the earth. Well, I think this gets to the point of frame of reference. It's from Noah and the people on the ark perspective that they can see the mountains in the distance. But now the frame of reference is not the mountains in the distance. The frame of reference, or for the people on the ark to see the mountains in the distance, it's the dove's point of view. The dove doesn't have that kind of range. Dove gets out and there's water over all the surface of the earth. From the dove's point of view, the earth is still completely covered. So it comes back to Noah and the ark, and then a total of 3 times. When you go to the next slide. So Noah sends out the raven on the 11th day of the 11th month, and then Noah sends out the dove 3 times. Next slide, please. Now here's where it gets very significant for me. By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry. By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. At this point, are there no rivers, oceans, streams, ponds, lakes? Clearly, I think absolutely clearly, the frame of reference here is from Noah and the people in the ark. Because obviously we still have oceans and rivers and streams and so forth. So my point is, if the frame of reference here is from Noah's point of view, what keeps it from being the frame of reference for the entire creation story? The entire flood account. Clearly, I believe that the frame of reference is from man's perspective. Next slide, please. So we can complete our chronology here. Is water drying up from the earth? He says the water had dried up in the first day of the first month, but then the earth is completely dry in the 27th day of the second month. This really fits with a massive local flood, because what you have is, as the water rises, the ark hits bottom. As the water recedes, the ark would hit bottom. So the water flooding, the water comes up. In the horizon, you can't see anything. As the water starts to recede, boom, the ark hits the bottom. Still can't see anything in the distance. Now the water comes down a little more. Now you can finally see some of the tops of the mountains in the distance. Now that makes good sense. Now as the water comes down further, you're getting some land that's close enough so that when the dove goes out, the dove can pick the olive branch, and then of course the dove eventually doesn't come back. So now as the water continues to recede, first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water's completely gone down, but the ground is still saturated. So it still takes another almost 2 months for it to get to the point where Noah and the animals that they had brought with them can come out of the ark. This to me fits perfectly with the massive local flood. Next slide, please. And some other passages help with some insight to this. But they deliberately forget that long ago, by man's word, the heavens existed and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. Next slide. And go back to that slide for a second. So the point here that this is Peter is making, notice he says the world of that time. The world at the time the event took place. He's making a distinction. The world at the time is different than the world today. Next slide. And this is Psalm 104, 5-9, where it talks about God bring the water down, and at the end he says, you set a boundary that cannot cross, talking about the water. Never again will it cover the earth. So in Psalm 104, which is a creation psalm, it's saying these waters, they're going to flow down the mountains and so forth, but eventually they'll reach a place they cannot cross. Never again will they cover the earth. Next slide. And Paul in Romans 1:8 says, first I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. Was Paul referring to the people in Australia? The people in North America? No, he's referring to the Roman Empire. To a Roman citizen, that was the entire world. As a matter of fact, the word global wasn't even in our dictionary 100 years ago. So, and if you look at any of the older commentaries, 19th century and earlier, most of them will say, this is a massive local event. We didn't even, right, 500 years ago, we weren't even sure it was a globe. So, again, one of these arguments that, that you believe the Bible, you have to believe that it covered the entire planet, I would say is not supported biblically. One thing we can totally agree on is this was universal. It affected all of humanity, and all humanity came out of these people groups. Next slide, please. So what's the conclusion? Genesis describes a universal flood that impacted all of humanity and everything affected by man's sin. I think that's a reasonable conclusion. Again, is it okay to believe in a global flood? Just be aware that you're going to be possibly hindering somebody from coming to faith in Jesus Christ. And again, I would just encourage you not to use it as a stumbling block. A lot of this arose, actually the first time it was seriously put into writing was in 1930. I think the man's name was Price. And he was trying to explain the geology on the earth. And he thought, well, maybe it was a massive flood that caused all the geology, because all the geology was seeming to indicate that the earth was billions of years old. And even if you could use the flood to explain the geology on the earth, which I don't believe you can, it does nothing to show the geology on Mars, Venus, Mercury, the moons of Jupiter, Saturn, and so forth. We see evidence of great time passage in those areas. Just look at the moon. Its craters scarred. Yet, since man has been looking at the moon, there's been evidence only of one collision taking place on the moon. One, as man's observed. It's about 900 years ago, I believe. So this idea, again, that to use the flood to try to explain the age that we observe, I just think is really an unnecessary argument. The starlight we see, all those beautiful pictures Jane showed in the first segment, most of those things would have to be simply illusions that God put out there. And I just don't see that God would deceive in that manner. To create that kind of deception would be outside of God's character. So we have time for a few questions. Oh, one more slide. We do have a new DVD out. This is within the last year, in the days of Noah. Really will help to answer all your questions you would have on this. So, questions? Anybody? Any questions on this? Good question. I would say probably there was some divine intervention or good cages. And the numbering of the animals was probably in the several hundred pairs, maybe into the low thousands, not much more than that. And one of the ironies is, one of the arguments is, well, God didn't put like horses, zebras, donkeys in there, just one horse pair. And then, after they came out of the ark, they became zebras, donkeys, and so forth. I go, well, if you believe that, then you believe in a far greater degree of evolution than even a Darwinian evolutionist believes in. You're not going to get a zebra from a horse in a few generations. That is hyper-evolution. So be careful. They said what the irony is, and I think this maybe show where some of the fear from a young earth creationist view is coming, is if you believe you can get zebras from horses in a few generations, it's no problem to get humans from apes in a few generations. And I would argue that you can't get that in millions of years, probably not even billions of years, the kind of change they're talking about. I don't think you can even get a zebra from a horse in